Welcome back to my channel, and thank you for joining me with my second video. I really wanted to do something special for Halloween. I had every intention to make this video a shorter one than my first, but if you're watching this now, you can probably tell that it is not. But it was important to me to make sure that I did include the painting phase this time, as I didn't want to have another unfinished project on my channel. If you've seen the description of my last video, you'll know that I've been having lots of technical difficulties, and I almost wasn't able to post this video as there was some problems with my hard drive and storage, and I nearly lost hope for the entire thing. But as you can see, if you're here, I did manage to get it all together. So, since you're here, I'd love to take the chance to ask that if you haven't already and you've seen my first video and you enjoyed it, please subscribe and press the bell button so that you'll be notified next time I come out with a video. And as always, liking and commenting is a free way to help me continue what I'm doing. Reading the comments on my last video really made me smile, and it made my day, and it just made me want to carry on. So I do appreciate and read every comment that is left on my video. So you've been watching me make my armature for this new sculpture. I was inspired this time by Scottish folklore and a mythical shape-shifting spirit known as the Kelpie. The legends of these shape-shifting water horses developed as a cautionary tale to keep children away from large bodies of water. Local variations of this legend can be associated with almost every loch and every river in Scotland. And I'm sure it comes at no surprise that the notorious Loch Ness has the most reported sightings of this mythical waterhorse. The inspiration for this sculpture came from a recent trip to Scotland that I did to visit family. Whilst I was there, it rained a lot of the time, which was a nice break from the heatwave that we were currently experiencing lower in the country in England. All of the hills and cliffs and dramatic clouds really makes you understand where legends like this could have originated, surrounded in beautiful coastal environments that were both haunting and incredible at the same time. As you've been seeing me making my armature for this sculpture, you probably noticed that instead of making something that's removable from the base, this time it is attached directly to the pieces of wood. I used some screws to anchor it in and then wrap the wire around those screws. This is just because I knew this sculpture would probably be a little bit top heavy, and I didn't want it to be falling out of the base as I was making it. If you remember the qualms I had with this particular white clay in my last video, you'll know that I was absolutely elated when I was able to finish up that pack on this first pass of this sculpture. And here I didn't want to take any risks by having the extremities of this sculpture made out of the regular Sculpey that I'm using here, as I was hyper aware that it might chip for some of the smaller details that I will be adding later. So all the extremities I have made in this flexible grey clay so that when they're cured they won't be brittle. So here I'm starting by plotting out the dorsal and ventral ridges of either half of the fish part of this water horse, and then blending them back into the tail. And here I'm just wrapping some wire around the legs as I don't want the clay slipping off. As mentioned before, I'm using the flexible clay on these legs, as not only will it make it slightly easier to repose them when I realise later on inevitably that they are not in the correct position, it just also means that bits are less likely to shear off once they're baked. Now I'm I'm giving the body one of many sands that I will do over the course of the sculpture, as I want to keep a flat base before I start applying more details to the clay. And because I thought it would be easier to figure out where these parts are going to go once I had the main shapes made, I'm marking out areas on the ventral area for where I'm going to drill holes, as I still need some wires to stabilise the pairs of fins that I will be adding to this area. And then I'm just planning out where I'm going to widen out this dorsal area in order to sandwich the fins, and then I drill holes on all the areas that I've marked little X's. Measuring out and cutting some pieces of armature wire that I can fold in half and glue with some liquid clay that hardens when baked, and it makes a really good glue for things like this. So I trim those off, and then I start to apply the rest of the wires for the smaller fins. So while the glue doesn't keep them rigid just yet, once the whole sculpture has been baked, they will be solid. And once all of those wires were in, it made it easier to see roughly what shape they were going to be, so I do quite a lot of trimming. And now I can apply the other half of the dorsal ridge that I had planned earlier, and I just made sure to match up the back and the front so that the dorsal and ventral lines were roughly aligned. And I found a little stash of the horrible white clay, so I just used it to better bulk out the neck before I used the nice clay on top of it. When planning this video, I did collect quite a few references to be able to look at and compare what I was sculpting to as I went along. And while of course I couldn't find any photographs of kelpies, not to say that they aren't out there, but you never know, I did have lots of horses and lots of fish that I referenced during the sculpting process, and I wanted to make sure that the horse merged with the fish part without a clear boundary, as I didn't like the aesthetic of that in my head. And the way that I imagined it was, since the Kelpie is known for being a shapeshifter, one that can look like a horse or like a water creature or even a human, I thought it would be quite interesting to create a sculpture that was sort of in between two stages, in between a horse and a sea monster. And while I'm slowly building up the legs and shoulders of this horse, I thought it would be a good time to run by my viewers, or 20 of you, what sort of content you prefer. So this started out for me as semi-long form, very calm sculpting process, just getting in the zone and sculpting and watching the process. But it is a lot of work, and these last two sculptures that I have made have taken multiple weeks to complete, and even more time to finish the editing and post it. And while I love this long project, I thought I might try doing some shorter videos just in the gap between this and Christmas, as I would like to do a project for Christmas as well. But to avoid getting burnt out and not having time for anything else, which has very much been how these last two have gone, and while I've loved the process, I have found myself neglecting other things. I would love to post the painting phase of my last video as the next instalment on this channel, and then after that I have a sculpture that I've made off camera, and I thought I might paint that as well. or I could sculpt something new that's just a little bit less epic than the last two that I've done, and perhaps just have those scattered in between these longer videos, as I know some people really like long chill videos. I definitely do. I quite often end up falling asleep to them. But just to make sure that I'm, balancing this and not going too crazy every single video, I thought maybe I could try some slightly shorter ones. Famous last words, obviously, they'll probably still end up half an hour, possibly. But just if you fancy commenting and letting me know what you think, I would be interested to see what everybody prefers. As with most cryptids and sort of mythical creatures, there are lots of different portrayals of the Kelpie in literature. The most common being a large, beautiful black horse that inhabits deep pools, lochs and rivers of Scotland. However, there are variations where the Kelpie is a white horse who lures victims onto its back by singing. Another variation depicts the Kelpie as a horse with a mane of serpents, similar to Medusa. But a feature that a lot of these stories can agree on is that this is a creature that can shapeshift into non-equine forms and can take the outward appearance of human figures with great beauty to lure lone travellers back to the waters to their doom. There are some accounts of the equine form of the Kelpie being able to extend the length of its back in order to carry multiple people down to the water. And while it'll be evident in the painting phase which of these descriptions I chose to pull my inspiration from, a much darker side of this sculpture has been inspired by the fabled sticky, magical hide that will not allow its victims to dismount once they are lured onto its back. So, as I mentioned before, I didn't want to have a horse that then there's a line and underneath that line is fish. I wanted it to flow like one complete creature. So while here I'm applying rib-like structures to the torso of the horse, I'm also keeping in mind the types of shapes that both aquatic mammals and reptiles display as part of their anatomy. Of keeping this video as short as I could possibly make it without taking out too much footage, there'll be times where I sculpt something on one side and then I might not show the opposite side, just as you already seen me sculpt it once. You don't need to see me sculpt it again. Now I've baked it and everything is locked in, so I can just add some more details to parts that I didn't want to squish before baking it. And then with editor magic, I'll just finish this side off and you don't need to see that, you just know that I've done it. And then I start to add some of the trapezius muscles in to try and blend them in with this skinny ribby looking bit. And then add on the withers. Doing here is basically just sort of mirroring all of the work that I did on the dorsal side, but just doing it on the ventral side. As most of the reference material for this portion of the sculpture was footage of pikes, I tried to keep the tail looking as realistic as possible whilst also being ethereal and mystical and pretty, with a little bit of pizzazz thrown in. I wanted to make sure that the anatomy was believable, at least from an ergonomics point of view. So the tail is large and powerful, but it's not completely round like a cartoon mermaid or something. It looks like a fish with the top dorsal area and a ventral area and scales all down the sides. And I really am not sure what I was doing here exactly with these wobbly liney bits, but it was to try and serve as a demarcation between these ribs and the tail, and I guess what I did with them in the end works for me, but I don't really know what I was doing there. Here I'm using little half moons of clay to build up a gill area. I thought it was a nice addition to try and carry on the aquatic nature from the bottom all the way up to the top without changing too much of the horse's major features. And after sculpting this part, I really didn't want to sculpt it again, but then I realised I didn't really have to because of the fact that I wanted to put a nice big mane on the other side. So I'm using my nice pointy Frankenstein tool that you'll have seen in the other video. I really ought to get some proper sculpting tools, but you know, that's a future cost that I'm not going to worry about right now. And I am making little frilly bits inside each of the gills. As you can see, it was very satisfying to make. And then I make sure to apply lots of scaly details to this part that doesn't make it to the final sculpture, but you know, it's the thought that counts, isn't it? And I know I probably lost a few of you in the last bit when I said that I liked how this ribby, fishy part ended up turning out well. So here's a little bit more encouragement, and yeah, it does look a bit better in the end once it's all painted. Just, you might have to trust me on this one. That being said, I swear every time I watch somebody else make sculptures, it just looks good from the beginning till the end. I genuinely don't understand how they're doing that. Like, my sculptures are very much trust the process, because they usually start out looking awful, especially with this clay that looks like raw chicken. And I tend to have a very odd way of sculpting where I build things from the inside out, which can end up looking a bit gross, to be honest. So, especially when it comes to the face of this sculpture. So yes, I apologise in advance. So, remember what I said about part of the gills not making it into the sculpture? Well, here it is as I've removed the entire gill plate, but then subsequently decide that I do not want to sculpt it again. So I do what I did in my last sculpture, where I just shift it back, put a little bit more clay on there, and then I just squish it back on in the position that I want it. And it works, which is really good because I did not have the willpower to do that again, especially after I'd told myself that that was the only time I was going to have to do it, because of the fact that the majority of its mane is going to be lying on the other side of its neck. And I will say, I think the key to avoiding being burnt out from doing lots of details like this is, even if you really can't be bothered to fix a mistake, it's really important to be excited and proud of the piece that you're creating. And if you've ignored a mistake and you notice it later when you've finished and you can't go back, you'll be that much less interested in the project, that it can cause you to feel like you've wasted time, feel like you've not improved, and just feel like you've failed, essentially. And I have a lot of projects where I haven't wanted to fix things and go back and undo something I've just done. And the final product, you know, I look at it and I think, well, I'm not very happy with it. Like with my first sculpture, there's parts of that that I look at and I think, well, I went back and fixed so many other things, why didn't I go back and fix that? And at the end of the day, it was just because I thought, well, I'm sure it'll look fine in the end, and it looks fine, but there's a difference between looking fine and looking how you wanted it to turn out. And as an artist, I think a lot of us, if we can't bring to fruition the picture that we have in our heads, we are so hard on ourselves and make ourselves feel like we haven't succeeded when you have. But you know, it might have been better if you'd stopped and had a break and then you've gone back and undid what you did wrong and carry on with the knowledge that even though it might feel like you're undoing your hard work, you're only bettering the outcome, and you'll thank yourself for putting in that extra work when you can look at it later and think, I made that? I think we are our worst critics, and sometimes it's okay to be proud of something, so it's okay to take that extra time to make it the way that you envisioned. And that's one of the reasons why it took much longer than I wanted for this video to come out, and that's okay, because at the end of the day I will have got it out on time. My goal was before Halloween, and it's out before Halloween, but I'm happy with what I've made. And sure, there's always things that you look at and you think, oh well, I can improve that next time, and that's good because you can keep pushing yourself and keep gaining your skills and developing and becoming a better artist every time. Nobody starts out the best version of themselves. And on the other hand, it's okay to be okay with something. If you're not massively happy but you can't see a way to fix it, then it's okay to leave it alone and come back to it when you have a better headspace, or you have improved your skills, or even you've just grown up and you realise that it's really not that deep. And it's okay if things are imperfect, but there is a balance between making sure that you're not too proud to recognise that you've made a mistake, but if you've made a mistake that you can't rectify or that you're okay with it existing, to just let it be, and next time you know what you can do better. Plot twist, I'm not talking about art. No, just joking. I also might not be joking. Yeah, so I blacked out for a minute there, but what you've been watching is me using a little stamp that I made out of Milliput and just stamping on some cute little scales, which I really did not want to sculpt by hand, and I think it turned out really nice, especially with the paints and the glazes that I put on later, as you will see. And now I'm working on little legs and adding some details and putting clay on and taking clay off just as I see, and using my references, of course. Slabs of clay when I do large surfaces, but ideally in the future I'd like to get a pasta maker that I use just for clay, because I've seen others use it and it just looks so much easier. So you know, I try and keep the budget for these videos as low as possible, so I can't go out and just splash out on a bunch of tools and bits that I need. So hopefully when this if this channel goes anywhere, hopefully I'll be able to get up to some even more crazy stuff. take a moment to just drill into his neck, out of context, that sounds funny. And then I put some liquid clay in, and as you can see I broke it, so I had to patch that up before I put in my wires. That wouldn't normally happen, but because I'm being stingy, I have used the thinnest possible layer of clay on this armature, so it did just crack a little bit there, but it's okay, it's nothing I can't fix. For a bit more fun stuff, so I'm adding parts of the face on now, and I'm very happy that I did move that gill plate, because the parts of the face that I'm building now you would have not seen it anymore, it would have just been hidden, so I am glad that I shifted it back. It looks much better where it is now. It was worth a little bit of demolition. And I'm still learning where to put my hands when I'm filming, because sometimes I just completely obscure everything, so apologies for that. Using a cotton bud again to make the eye holes. I think I cover these up in a minute and have to do them again because I wasn't happy, which is just a metaphor for my life. Go. And again. They do look better this time though, I will admit. I remember thinking at this point that it really looks like a seahorse, like, you know, the actual seahorse as in a creature that exists. And I was thinking, because I've always loved seahorses, I was thinking, oh, maybe I should do a seahorse sculpture in the future. But seeing how reluctant I was to sculpt scales, I don't think that's quite going to work right now. But, you know, let me know if you want me to do a seahorse sculpture. Meanwhile, my Kelpie is resembling a bike seat. So, yeah, well, maybe I should sculpt a bike next, seeing as clearly I'm halfway there already. This little noodly bit of clay I put underneath the jaw, sort of attaching to the gill plate to look a bit more like the underside of a fish, where their gills typically kind of form a V underneath their head, and I think it merged quite well. You can't really see that it's not meant to be there, if that makes sense. Segue, as before, I spend a lot of time sculpting this and then immediately cover it up with something else. So forget everything I just said, but also it's the thought that counts. I didn't add any wires for the ears, I just kind of squished on some little devil horns and used the flexible clay. Because they're pointing backwards, like you see here, they don't really need a huge amount of support, and I'm kind of going to be surrounding them with lots of locks of hair, so I wasn't really worried about them getting bonked or snapped. But I think if I was going to be doing forward facing ears, I would have had to really use some wires as well at this point. But I didn't really feel like drilling into his head for no reason. Again, context. Oh god, he actually looks really creepy right now. Okay, good, I'm giving him a jaw now so he looks slightly less demented. This is a theme I'm sensing. I really ought to try and change my workflow so that my sculpts don't look quite as spooky as they do halfway through. Although this is a Halloween video, so maybe it's appropriate this time, I don't know. Let me know what you think. The references that I had for the head and neck of this part was mostly Frisian horses, which is a very stately, all-black Baroque breed that was developed for drawing coaches and similar. And as a result of people wanting identical pairs of coach horses, all the other colours were bred out, all white markings were bred out, and they all look very, very similar. There is a substandard which involves chestnut ones, but they are very rare and not part of the regular breed standard. So black, spooky, cool looking horses, very majestic, so a lot of period dramas tend to drop them in to their productions for absolute historical accuracy. But you know, them and Andalusians tend to play most of the horses in cinematic pieces. But anyway, I digress. I'm modelling this off of Frisian because they have long, very noble looking faces, and their thick wavy manes really remind me of a kelp forest that you might see in the ocean, as well as the fact that around their hooves they've got long wavy feathers, which again kind of give me kelp vibes, as like the whole horse perhaps is made out of kelp and it's all like dripping off every extremity and it looks really cool. I don't know, that's just kind of vibe I went with. So despite the fact that I made all of the fins and the legs and the ears and stuff out of this flexible clay, I did actually manage to snap a piece of the fin off at one point when I was taking it out the oven. I think it's just because this clay is a bit brittle when it's still cooling down and it's a bit more, you know, likely to break. But I don't think anybody is ever going to be able to tell which one it was. If you think you can see it, let me know in the comments. I'll tell you if you're right, but I don't think you're going to notice, which is great because that means I did a good job fixing it. And yeah, honestly, I keep forgetting which one it is, so you know, that's great. I did get it on camera, I just don't think I included the footage, so I'm not going to go out of my way to expose the fact that I'm really a human. Also, it's probably really obvious, but on the lead up to finishing this video and doing this voiceover, I was getting a super sore throat and I was sure I was going to get a cold, and I was just like absolutely necking hot drinks and like honey and lemon and stuff, and you'll probably see like several mugs and that floating around in some of these in these videos, but I managed to escape it. I don't think I was getting a cold, which is great, but I still have a bit of a sore throat, so apologies, probably sound really crusty, but I'm trying my best, so yeah, sorry about that. Also, something about this footage where he's lying on my octopus and he's looking really angry with his legs in the air makes me feel like he's having a tantrum. I don't know, it just made me laugh. Yeah, so anyway, I'm sculpting his nostrils out of the flexible clay using my little ball stylus just to gently squish them onto the face, making sure they're nice and modelled out, and softening everything with the Q-tip, which is my favourite tool at this point, and I really need to find an alternative because I hate how quickly I'm going through them. I actually really like looking at this part of the footage where the details are really starting to bring it together and it doesn't look quite so decrepit anymore. I'm sure there's probably somebody who's watched my video halfway through and just gone, is there a point where this gets better? And they just click off and leave. So yeah, that's a problem. I should probably do something about that, but oh well, it's funny. The ones that stay, you know, they get the real deal. And for this video I've kind of planned a lovely epic reveal at the end, so stay tuned for that because I really like it and I'm really proud of it, which is a lot because I don't often admit or even feel proud of the stuff that I make. So yeah, I think I did good. I did good, I think. Oh, and in remembrance of that piece that I added, slaved over and then removed, I make this little piece on top of the gill plate with the same stamps and the same sort of scale patterns on it, and actually prefer that being there than where I put it before, so, and it looks more anatomically correct. Not that fish, horse exist, but you know what I mean. Oh, and another aside, as you can see the ears from this angle, they're very like hooked inwards, and I took inspiration from a particular breed of horse originating from India, which is called a Kathiawari. They are a very pretty looking breed, but their most distinct feature are their long, curly, almost touching in the middle ears, and I think it gives this sculpture a nice eldritch looking pixie looking vibe to hopefully sell the ethereal nature of this sculpture. Now I'm finally doing some work on the little chicken wings, giving him some hooves and smoothing it all out, and then marking out the top of the hoof wall, and then I add some clay softener just to really make that surface nice and smooth. And then I realised that the leg is not thick enough, so I need to add a nice piece of muscle underneath. Now for the eagle-eyed amongst you, there will have been some noticeable continuity errors in the backdrop of the previous footage, and that will have been bits and pieces of this guy. I spent about 30 minutes sculpting him, and then I threw him in the bin. No, I didn't. I turned him into this guy, which is a lot smaller and better scale-wise for what I had in mind, because the other guy was just a little bit too big. This guy is much better anyway, and he's kind of cute. So I baked him in this little piece of steel wool because he kept falling over, and I found that really easy to keep him upright in the oven, which was great. I put him on a little stick and I put some detail on him, and yeah, I was having this going alongside the main sculpture. I was referencing the size, but also it was something to do whilst other parts were either baking or, you know, I was having a break from doing all the main bits. Sometimes you just need like a change of scenery. But anyway, I just wanted to compile all of the footage of the little skeleton dude into one piece, just so that it wasn't confusing and it wasn't scattered all over the place, and it just made it a bit easier to follow, I think. So what was really helpful was having my phone there with a to scale reference that I was able to use to keep measuring him up against and just making sure that it was proportional. Obviously I've done a little bit more like cartoony proportions just for the sake of art, but I wanted to keep it believable, and so yeah, I'm using it to just keep the proportions the same and use it as a reference. And because I knew I wouldn't be consistent with it, I didn't want to individually sculpt every single rib, so this was a good compromise. You could just carve out the gaps in between and then rely on my painting job to help sell it later. As it is right now, it doesn't really look like a rib cage, but we'll just let it slide, trust the process and just go with it. So I baked that part and started working on the pelvis. Everything kind of had to be baked in pieces, because if I was to work on another piece, then I was just having to hold the previous pieces I made and they were getting squished, so yeah, that's how I did it. Because I'm stupid, I didn't wrap any of the limb wires around the main wire, so I just ended up having to sculpt both of them into the clay parts that I'd put on there. So, you know, it worked, but it would have been stronger if I'd wrapped them around the main wire. But, you know, we live and we learn. So I freed him from his oven torture and bent his legs into position, and he looks kind of funny right now. I can just imagine him doing a little dance. Tailbone, and it's not realistic, but it's implied. But you know, I had to kind of not get too locked into the tiny details on this because I was already taking too long, and I think I was like 2 weeks, solid weeks. I'd gone over weekends and I'd not really had a break, so I was just like ready to get this sculpture done without sacrificing the bigger picture, to make sure what I was working with was consistent with the rest of the piece. Truthfully, it was kind of nice to be able to allow myself to sculpt something a little bit spookier and a bit darker than usual, because as with most people who create things, there's a lot of sadness and a lot of darkness that we all hold, I think, and sometimes it's nice to bring that out into some of our work. And even though I do love to do the whimsical and the cute and fluffy stuff, this time it was a little bit cathartic to just tell a slightly darker tale with my art than what I've posted before, because sometimes it can be quite divisive, but you know, Halloween is a good time to be dipping into the spooky bits because everybody wants to be a little bit spooked on Halloween, don't they? And it's my birthday tomorrow, so I feel like I give myself a bit of a treat. I did end up letting my impulsive thoughts win, and I made him do a little dance. So yeah, here was my method of getting the arms to slot in without being that noticeable. Once it was all painted, you couldn't really tell that there was a wire in there, so it was good enough. And this was one of the times I was willing to accept good enough. I really did not want to take apart the whole guy and start again, because, you know, a lot of hours went into him, and it was just something that I did not want to repeat. It'd probably be a long time before I do another skeleton because it was just so fiddly. But it was worth it, and I'm glad that I went as far as I did with all of these little bits and details, because it does come out well in the final piece. So I sculpted his tibia with clay, but I wanted to add the fibula in with a little piece of wire, and then I made sure to cause grievous bodily harm to the camera whilst I was doing it. But anyway, I think this turned out better than if I was going to try and make that out of clay, because it would not have held. And then I stuck him back in the birth canal so he can go and bake safely in the oven. I was quite happy with the proportions at this point. He was looking like a skeleton. So we're back to the main sculpture, and I was doing some sanding just to smooth out some of the rough edges on the fins. And then I got some nice Victorian shoe shiner vibes from doing it to his hooves. And then I found that if I just put some liquid clay over the sanded parts once I baked it, it came out quite smooth. Now I took the little guy out of the oven and I made some little feet for him, but I apparently don't have that footage, but here's me making the start of them. And then I positioned him onto the back of the Kelpie, and I twisted his right arm around one of the wires just to keep him there while I glued the rest of him. And I wanted to sculpt his hand like pressed into the flesh on the horse's shoulder, as if it's stuck and he can't take it off. Of course, this guy is obviously long gone, but we can just imagine that he's been there since he was lured to the water and subsequently devoured by this beast. Just winged it when it came to the hands, because I've never been a hands kind of artist. There are hands artists and there are non-hands artists, and I'm not one of the hands artists, that's for sure. So I just kept working at it until it looked the way that I had mostly imagined it, and once the paint's on later it does look a lot better than it does right now. My Frisian looked a bit like he had an underbite, so I just wanted to carve out a little bit, and he looked a bit more shapely then, and then I gave him a little bit of a sand just to smooth down that Roman nose. So now that he'd been baked and the rest of his body was attached to the horse, I could move his other arm away, and I started working on the mane, and I wanted him to be gripping part of the mane, so that would mean that I kind of had to sculpt his other hand and the mane together. So I just bent out of the way for now, put some foil inside my wires, and then I sculpted the clay on top to just sandwich that in. I wanted to use the foil just because I'm a cheapskate and I didn't want to use all clay. As with most of the different sort of techniques that I have, when I sculpt hair it is kind of chaotic. I just kind of do a base shape, and I will tend to kind of sandwich in like hair by hair details, and then I'll go back to doing lumps again, and it kind of goes back and forth until I'm happy with the way that it looks. And I was making sure, because I knew that I would be doing quite a lot of hair, that any of the bits that would be really hard to reach once I did the top parts were rendered enough that it wouldn't matter if I couldn't reach them later. A lot of them obviously you won't see. I tend to have a habit of going a bit ham and then covering it up, but I'd rather take the time to do it first, and then I would thank myself later when I wouldn't have to undo stuff I'd done. And now at this point I was able to make a start on his other hand, and I just made a little fist, and then I used the end of the armature wire just to kind of hook it into place, and then I pushed it in and did a bit of sculpting around it just to make it look as if it is actually grabbing the hair and it's not just on top. Even though I was absolutely exhausted at this point of the sculpt, I could finally see parts that I had envisioned really early on finally coming together, and it definitely gave me the energy I needed to carry on. I had come off of my other video and pretty much immediately started this one with the intention obviously of getting it out earlier than I am, but I know that having taken the extra time on it and actually throwing myself at it and have a couple late nights and have all dayers, and you know, I didn't have a huge amount of time when I wasn't working on this other than when I was sleeping, which as an aside is important. Sleep is important. You need to look after yourselves. I know that there is this culture of glorifying the grind and throwing your entire ass into something, but honestly it's not worth it. Sometimes you need to look after yourself. Anyway, it definitely shows, and I am proud of it, and I'm happy that I put the time into it. But as I said before, I'm going to be doing a similar length video for something that I'm going to be working on Christmas, and I've already got some ideas and it's quite exciting, so hopefully I can get that one out in a bit more of a timely manner. But I want to, in the meantime, have smaller projects to put out for you guys to watch and for me to also be excited about, because that's important too. So yes, painting, sculptures, maybe sculpting something smaller. I'd like to do some dioramas and things like that. So anything that I do creatively, I will probably start to get some footage of. I'm not just a sculptor. I do painting, I do, drawing, I do textiles, I do taxidermy. I will always be doing something, and if I can get that into a video format, then not only is it a nice little portfolio for me, but also, this would be my dream to make something like this my job. And it seems very out of reach at the moment, but I am in a position where I can put energy into it right now, and I hope it goes somewhere. Bulking it out with some of the regular clay, and then I will go in with the flexible clay and add some to the wires later, just for more wavy, tendrily bits that I don't want breaking off. As I'm watching this back, I'm starting to wonder if I should rein back on the amount of footage that I pack into this video. Obviously I've not done this for very long. I've literally this is my second video, but I'm trying new things and I want to find out what people like and don't like, and just going from the vibes of my first video, this one is very much a similar journey, but I would be willing to try and show less or speed it up a bit or try and cut big pieces out, but I really condensed this as much as I could without removing large portions of the creation. So If you think that I should produce more of a supercut and less of a step-by-step, then let me know your thoughts, and I hope that if you're an artist watching this that you've learnt something, as I find it really beneficial to watch other people do things that I like to do, as it gives me another perspective, and quite often I'll end up having some kind of eureka moment and finally I can do something I couldn't before, and I just learned so much by watching other people. It just makes a lot more sense to me. You can see just between the two pieces of hair there that I've sculpted just the outside of the gill cover that I did on the other side, just to create a contrast between the large mats of mane, as when I paint this detail it does stand out quite a bit, and it didn't look quite right without it mirrored on this side. Now I'm making most of these little tendrils out of the flexible clay, as even though they're not really sticking off the body, it does help me with the sculpting when I can see that contrast between the pink and the grey. And then of course here they'll be standing away from the main structure, so they really need to be self-supporting really, and not be brittle. And then here I'm adding the top part of the coronet, which is the area above the hoof, and I'm making sure it's nice and fluffy looking, using my little ball stylus to make some little hair details into it, just brushing everything with the clay softener. And then just adding some little spikes onto the ends of the fin here, and I do these to all of the fins just to make them look a little bit less soft and make them look a little bit scarier and a little bit more ornate. Definitely glad that I added this detail, because the lower half definitely looked a little bit plain, but I will say the painting does a lot of the heavy lifting for that part. And having learned from my last sculpture, I made sure that the veins that I was adding were super small and well blended, so that when they're painted they don't stick out quite so much, and they definitely look better on this sculpture. So while he was in for one of the final bakes, I was making lots and lots of different pieces of kelp and seaweed and different little plants that kind of drape all over him. I won't show the process for every single one, but this one was the most cool, I think. So I did make two like this, and then I made a couple other types using real waterweed and seaweed as references, but obviously putting my own little spin on some of it as well. I was really looking forward to this part, and I think it was because I knew that not only was it basically the last detail I needed to add, but also it just really brings everything together, and rather than looking like just, well, I mean, it doesn't look like a regular horse, but it just gives it a bit more of a rugged and scruffy vibe, which I feel like if you live in a lake or in the sea, you probably will pick up a few bits and pieces here and there. work to the base. As you can see, I've already sanded off some bits just around the edges, but here I'm adding a bit of foil to the front and the back because I want the base to be round. So I'm brushing it with liquid clay, and then I covered it with Sculpey and squished it together so there was no air bubbles. And I'm using a very large ball stylus just to scratch the surface to give the impression that it's rocks, but also it does help to compress the clay a little bit better. Even though this was the base of the sculpture, I still wanted to make sure that I added a lot of detail into it. So I made sure to add lots of little bits and bobs to bring it to life. So off camera I made a bunch of skulls out of milliput, and I just set them all around on the base in chaotic positions. And then I made some droopy seaweed, which I saw while I was in Scotland, and I was absolutely gobsmacked by how neon green it was, so I definitely brought that into my piece here. It just looked like lots and lots of bright green clown hair drooping all over the rocks, and I definitely wanted to make something that reminded me of that, so that's what I did here. Baked it at this point to set what I'd done. And then on top of that stringy seaweed I added some little bits of kelp, just as another layer of detail, and it would be obviously more colours, more textures, and more the merrier, and added in some bones as well that I'd made at the same time as I made the skulls. The kind of vibe I was going for was like some kind of creature's lair where all of their victims, you know, their bones are scattered around, and it's all gungy and dark and a little bit sticky and probably smells terrible. And that's kind of what I was going for here, which is delightful, I know. Oh yeah, and I forgot to add teeth when I was sculpting the face, so I thought I'd go in now and add those. And then after that it had its final bake and the sculpt is done. And unlike the last video, I'm going to include the painting this time. So I don't have a primer, so I just went and covered the entire base with black. Every single surface I could reach I painted black. And then once it was dried I started by adding some sea green details to some of the high points. Just kept going in with slightly lighter colours just to build some texture and some life to its face. I had this very vivid idea of making these water reflections as part of its coat pattern, as it really made me feel like this isn't just a black horse painted green, it's something more mystical, and it reminded me of being in a coastal cave and the lights hitting the water in a certain way and these shapes are dancing on the rocks around you. This footage, I definitely didn't remember the colours going on quite like this, but it's always hard to capture reality in a lens, no matter how expensive the camera is. Although these cameras definitely could capture better footage, I have a lot to learn. For the Kelpie itself, I tried to keep my colour palette really narrow and only used 3 basic colours for all of the greens. Because I was working in dark colours, I didn't want anything to just become muddy from being overmixed or overblended, and I quite often work with very limited colour palettes anyway, and I don't typically use pre-mixed colours. I prefer to mix all of my own colours. It makes a lot more sense to me to put the money into 4 or 5 really good paints and use those for everything, than buying lots of the pre-mixed colours. I think sometimes it's easy to get overwhelmed when you have too many different colours that you can use. So on the fish part of this sculpture, I'm using a method that a lot of animals, but certainly aquatic animals, have evolved this colouring called countershading, where the lower half of their body is paler than the top half, and that is usually for stealth or camouflage, where anything that's swimming below them can't see them against the sunlight coming through. Whereas the top side, if they're looking down at the back of the animal, it's dark and it's harder to see amongst the shadows of the water. And of course it was definitely just a nice excuse to be able to add more tones of greens to the bottom half of this sculpture. I did use a few different references to base this colour pattern off, but ultimately I wanted to make sure that it looked in keeping with the horse part as well, so I did take some artistic liberties here. And to go back and add some spookier looking details to the face, I wanted to paint the gills red, and I made sure to add it to the nostrils as well. Although it is all sort of the same shift of green, this part of the sculpture is giving me blue-ringed octopus vibes. And after this, you're about to see my secret weapon for this sculpture. Look at how amazing this green shift paint looks on top of this pretty but very basic base layer that I've done. It just really elevates it to that next level, and I am so glad that I splashed out and bought this very, very tiny bottle of what is definitely meant for airbrushing. But it just came out so nice, and it's super reflective and super buildable, and I just can't get over how incredible it looks. I honestly think if I hadn't added this, the sculpture would be so basic, and I just don't think it would have given me the same excitement to see it done. It does look cool now, but just wait until you see it at the end. I just can't believe how cool it looks. And I had been waiting for this moment since the very beginning, and it was just so incredibly satisfying to finally be able to paint this layer. So after I got that out of my system and it all dried, I did go over everything else and just touch up the black so that next layer didn't have any of the iridescent paint on them. Now, I didn't want to do the skeleton bright white. I wanted it to be a more muted, old, almost like mummified looking bone, as if this guy has been stuck on there for a little while. But also, I just didn't think that white would look quite right against how dark everything else is. So here I'm just using a colour that I mixed that just gives me weathered bone vibes. It's light enough that obviously you can tell that they're supposed to be bones, and it helps me pick out these small details, but the brightest tone I think that I used on that is still very dark. If I was to put it on white paper, when I dry brush later, you'll be able to see that I do build up some paler tones, but colour theory of course is very deceiving, and if I was to paint the same bright tones that I paint on this onto a white surface, it would look very dark indeed. with this I'll go back and forth a little bit with the light and dark colours. So here I'm adding a bit of a rusty wash to the previous layer, and it just helps to round off the colours a bit better, and it settles into the cracks and just makes it look a little bit more, you know, rusty and worn and old. Do add a little dab of highlights just on the very ridges of the bones. I think this, yeah, I was using a very dry brush to add these so that it wouldn't just immediately flood with colour. It's more of a, you know, brush it over the textures, and the textures pick up very small amounts, but enough to really make a difference in how deep and how three-dimensional. As odd as it sounds, it is possible to make a 3D sculpture appear flat with a bad paint job. And a little rule of thumb for me is that if you're going to be using lots of tiny little brush strokes, it's easier to do that on a flat, smooth sculpt, but if you're planning on flooding large areas with simple colours, then something that is a bit more textured will pick up more of the detail, even if you're using a larger brush. And the rocks that I've sculpted are an example of that, and you'll see when I paint those later. Be easy to assume that the seaweed would just also be green, but actually a lot of the deeper weeds that grow are more brown and yellow and a little bit red, and that's the colour palette that I was going for these large wide pieces of kelp, and then I saved the green for the hairy algae type weed that I put on the rocks. And of course it wouldn't be right if I didn't cause blunt force trauma to the camera at least one more time, so just ignore that please. You can see here how dry brushing with your highlight colour really does elevate the textures that you've spent so much time sculpting, and it brings it out from being hidden underneath all those darker colours. And at this point I've just given the camera irreversible brain damage, so you'll just have to forgive how shaky it keeps getting. Like at this point I could just see the finish line and I really was just going for it. Adding in a little rusty red wash to all of the kelp, it just gives it another layer of depth. And if you're wondering what I'm doing here, I'm just dabbing off any excess with a little piece of paper towel. So my reference pictures for the base were actually lots of pictures that I took while in Scotland, and a lot of the rocks were this warm dove grey that was a bit more, I think it must have had iron deposits in it or something, but rather than it being a cold blue grey it was very warm, and then it was stark contrast to this super neon green that I mentioned. Looks like a witch's cauldron overflowing at this point. dry brushing on the base just to really bring out some of those scruffy details that I imparted really early on in the process of sculpting the base. And then I put in some dark watery green highlights just underneath all of the kelp, and then some super pale highlights to really accentuate all of the high points that the dry brushing picked up. And then just to top it off a little bit more dry brushing. Just top up all of the black details so that they can start from a dark base again, same as I did on the body. And a nice rusty red wash, just like the kelp, to really bring out all of the little divots and just make the tone a little warmer as well. One of the sort of estuary beaches that we visited had a very flat layer of red clay under the top layer of sand, which was really interesting. And then these little red streaks were all over the rocks, especially in the coastal caves, and I think it was little bits of iron just leaking out, and I think it adds a really creepy touch to the pile of bones as well. I'm putting in the darkest tone for this kelp. Again, I was using a more red, yellow and brown colour palette for these bits, because if it was all green it would look a little bit less impactful, and I wanted to make sure there was lots going on and lots of different colours, textures, and in a minute I'll be showing you as well some of the different glazes and finishes that I add to the rest of the sculpture as well. And the skulls on this part, I keep the colours similar to the skeleton riding the Kelpie, but I wanted them to look older even. And so I kept the tones very orangey and brown and just made them look like they've been underground or underwater for a long time. And when looking at the references for this, it was mostly like mummified bones or bulk bodies that had been discovered, and lots of them had slightly paler teeth like I've been adding in here. I definitely think it sells the age of these skulls. Dry brushing on the highlights onto the skulls and the bones, and then onto the kelp. And then I make sure just to add a very slightly paler tone to these rocks, but I didn't want to bring them too high because I wanted them to stay quite dark. We did find a lot of black pebbles around on the beaches and jasper as well. I had this idea to add gold highlights at the last minute, and I'm glad I did, because it does add a certain je ne sais quoi. That probably doesn't even mean what I think it means. To the gill plates as well. I thought it would be rude not to. And then finally I moved on to the eyes, and I was using I think it was an octopus eye as my reference, just with all these different colours in it. And it was close enough to a regular horse eye that I thought it was a nice touch with the little rectangle pupil in there. Somebody who's obsessed with tiny details, I do have annoyingly shaky hands. So I put some super glue on the bottom of the base and popped it on some fabric that's like thick felt type fabric, and just trimmed around the edges. I couldn't find my regular fabric scissors, so I ended up using these ones that destroy my thumb. There's something really satisfying about putting fabric on the bottom of a base. So the first of the glazes that I'm using here is a matte finish, where when it dries it will just have a very subtle soft shine but nothing glossy, same as a bone would be, I suppose. So I use that all over the skeleton, and I put it on the rock part of the base and also onto these skulls and the bones on the base. And onto the hooves, because I thought they looked a bit too shiny. Using this gloss one on all of the kelp and seaweed. On everything that I used this varnish, I did put a second coat on as well. And then in this little thing I'm mixing up some black glitter with some of the same varnish, and I made a mess, obviously, but I mix it all together really well, and it goes blue but it doesn't dry that way. And I put it all over the mane because I wanted it to have a bit of a sparkle, but I didn't want it to have the same iridescence as the body. I didn't want it to just disappear into the other shades of black and green. I thought to bring it back down to the base a little, I'll add some onto all the little black pebbles. And then I thought I'd add a little gold tooth, one of the skulls. So here I'm using UV resin onto the eyes and curing for, I think it was 1.5 minutes each. And I put some on the gills as well. Put some on the other eye. And then into the nostrils as well, to really get that wet look. And down on the base I put the UV resin onto all of the brown pieces of kelp. So now there are, I think, 4 different finishes on the base alone, which just makes it look so much more complex and immersive. Just made sure to cure all of the resin really well with the UV light so that none of it had a sticky finish. And then once the mane had dried, I put another clear layer of the gloss glaze on top of it with no glitter added, just to really smoothen the surface and enhance the shine of the glitter underneath. And I topped up any bits that needed some more iridescence. now the only thing left is As always, thank you so much for watching, and be sure to interact with the video in any way that you can just to help boost the algorithm, and I look forward to seeing you in the next one.